Basically said to myself, I need to fight back against this because I see these intellectual frameworks that I've absorbed and that I've used to try and understand the situation of the dishonoured people right in the face of European colonialism, and to help the dishonoured people and to express my solidarity with them as I do intellectual work. I see these same theories being weaponized against Jews.
Welcome to The Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. Hello, welcome to this edition of The Contrarian Podcast. I'm your host, David Bernstein. I'm delighted to be joined on a new series that we're doing on what I'm calling the new anti-anti-Zionism. And I'm joined by my friend, Phil Siegel, who's a philanthropist and businessman out of Austin, Texas. Phil has taken a very keen interest in the new anti-anti-Zionism. And we are together going to be interviewing a series of special guests and really delving into this new emerging field. Anti-Zionism has been around a while. We've all been commenting and worrying about the growth of anti-Zionism, but there's some new intellectual firepower behind this movement. And we're really delighted to have with us Adam Louis-Klein, who's one of the first people to really delve into it with great intellectual rigor. There's others you're going to be hearing from. I'm interested in this because I'm Jewish and a Zionist, but I'm also interested in this because I run an organization, the North American Values Institute, or NAVI, that is fighting against radical trends in K through 12 education in the United States and in North America. And these are the very ideological patterns that are playing out in our K through 12 schools. So we need to understand where they come from. I've always felt that we have a blind spot in the Jewish community about sort of larger ideological trends. We see the explicit anti-Zionism, we know, or anti-Semitism, and we know it well, but we don't understand its intellectual well springs, and we miss a lot when we don't understand that. And we end up fighting it the wrong way because we don't understand where it comes from and the motivations behind the various actors. So this is an attempt to go deep into these intellectual wellsprings and to also discuss the strategic logic and what we can do more effectively to counter these trends. So Adam, really appreciate your work and really appreciate you joining the podcast. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right. So the first question I have is, I understand that you have an interesting story that after October 7th, tell me a little bit about your personal story.
Yeah, so, if we're going to talk about radical and extreme leftist ideologies, I can maybe claim the credit of having been one of the more extreme leftists. So I studied philosophy at Yale for my undergrad, and I was actually very into Heidegger while I was at Yale, who was actually a Nazi. But I soon discovered this other thinker called Alain Badiou, who's a very important French communist philosopher who basically he was able to basically revive Maoism and give Maoism intellectual respectability, in big parts of kind of the Marxist left. People who read Jacobin, they read Alain Badiou. And I was very invested in his work. It's very impressive. He talks about philosophy of mathematics in super amazing ways. And so I joined a radical Marxist group when I was out of college. It was called Socialist Alternative, and it was actually further to the left than DSA, even though we were criticized as being kind of too reformist by the other parties. Yeah. So then I continued in academia, and I'm doing my PhD in anthropology. And obviously, basically everything you learn is post-colonial critique, and I work with indigenous peoples. So before October 7th, I was just completely immersed in this universe, socially, the people I knew, and also kind of intellectually. These were the kinds of theories, the kinds of terminology and categories I used to understand the world and to understand my own work. And then I was in the Amazon doing work with an indigenous people in the Colombian Amazon on October 7th. And on October 9th, I returned to a local town, still in the Amazon. I opened my computer. First thing I saw was the news of October 7th. Very quickly, what I saw also was the reactions of my friends and colleagues who were supporting October 7th and were already kind of stirring up a hate movement against Israelis and Jews, I was quickly purged from my social and professional networks simply for speaking out against anti-Zionism, which I was still calling anti-Semitism at the time, and just showing basic solidarity with Israelis. I was marked as a Zionist, and I was purged. And from there, I basically said to myself, I need to fight back against this because I see these intellectual frameworks that I've absorbed and that I've used to try and understand the situation of the Dishonor people, right, in the face of European colonialism, and to help the Dishonor people and to express my solidarity with them as I do intellectual work. I see these same theories being weaponized against Jews, right? These are theories that are about how colonial structures end up erasing and eliminating or attempting to forcibly assimilate different minority peoples and indigenous peoples. But now I see these same theories being perversely used against Jews in this inverse way. So Jews are now defined as the white settlers, right? So it acts as if it's an anti-colonial critique because Jews are the evil colonists in Israel. But of course, to define Jews as white settlers is to completely erase Jewish civilization and culture as rooted in the land of Israel for thousands of years. It's basically to act as if we don't have any right to self-definition, as if Jews are not even a real people. So it was trying to struggle with that crazy Orwellian inversion that I felt the need to kind of develop a language and a framework to understand anti-Zionism that could speak back to the critical academy.
Mhm. You make this distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Why is that useful?
It's useful because today we have a way of talking about anti-Jewish hate that linguistically and conceptually privileges classical anti-Semitism. And by classical anti-Semitism, I specifically mean the European 19th century and early 20th century anti-Semitism. It's usually associated with the right and it has a certain political logic. Basically, it's about Jews as racial infiltrators managing a kind of world conspiracy to undermine people's nations from within. Now, the Holocaust emerged from that anti-Semitism. So what happened after the Holocaust is this was such a massive event that all of Jew hatred previously was now retroactively aimed anti-Semitism. And our frameworks today around anti-Semitism almost always privilege classical anti-Semitism, right? Which is sometimes fused with medieval anti-Judaism in this conception as well, but it's usually Nazis that are kind of the paradigm. And so in any definition, right, whether it's the IRA, which is what most Jews prefer because it's more clear about anti-Israel rhetoric, or the JDA, which is basically that definition, the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism, which is what anti-Zionists prefer because it legitimizes anti-Zionist violence as resistance or as critique, or the Nexus, which is kind of a slightly in between, one could say, and is a newer definition. All of these definitions of anti-Semitism say this one thing. They actually all share this point. If you project onto Israel classically anti-Semitic tropes, that's anti-Semitic. And so what that means is when we play this game of when does anti-Zionism cross the line into anti-Semitism, when does it become anti-Semitism, what we're actually asking for is to show that anti-Zionism is sort of a bottom anti-Semitism, or it has to be recognizable as classical anti-Semitism to be seen as a bigotry. And as long as we do that, we don't name anti-Zionism, we don't describe it as its own form of anti-Jewish hate. We continue to assume that there's sort of only one kind of Jew hatred. It's a kind of homogenizing discourse. There's this thing called anti-Semitism. It's always existed, right? It's existed for thousands of years. And yes, Jew hatred has existed for thousands of years, but there's a lot of historical complexity and simplicity and an inability to see what's happening around us every single day, which is anti-Jewish violence that is based on anti-Zionism, that is based on calling Jews colonizers, Jewish supremacists, and genocidal, and not on calling Jews Semitic race infiltrators of our European nations.
Okay. Thank you for that. I thought that was a very good explanation. So you're talking about this inversion of indigeneity that is used, where Jews are portrayed as being the colonizers. And And I've read some of what you've written on this, and I'm not sure. I'm going to offer a gentle critique, but I want to flesh this out because I'm sort of in the early stages of my own journey and trying to understand what the various ways of doing and thinking about this are. I'm critical of the overall discourse, the postmodern, post-colonial discourse. I think the discourse is flawed. I think a lot of the discourse around indigeneity is flawed. Adam Kirsch wrote a lot about this in his book Settler Colonialism, and I suspect that we could settle on a definition of indigeneity that makes sense, but I worry it's just used to say that there's certain preferred privileged groups that the discourse defines as being indigenous and others are not, and maybe the whole concept is flawed. Is there really within what you might consider indigenous communities, they've been replacing each other for thousands of years with the last group to conquer them. So why bother with this discourse? Why not just suggest that the entire discourse is flawed? We become trapped within it. It's illiberal. It tends to be very illiberal. I suppose there could be a liberal version of it, but it tends to be illiberal, and it imposes upon itself on the entire discourse and insists on its own truth. Why not just reject it and say, let's stop talking about indigeneity and just speak about why anti-Zionism is bad? Because it attacks, a Jewish state. Why do we need to continue to use the discourse at all?
Yeah, so I actually 100% understand where you're coming from. I think the discourse of indigeneity today is extremely flawed, and even the discourse of indigeneity that's now coming out of the academy. And so more and more indigeneity, it's either understood as a kind of pure designation of victimhood, in which case it no longer is even about people's cultures. It's no longer even about their relationship to the land or their specific spiritual traditions, right, which I would want to know about ethnographically as an anthropologist, because I care about different people's cultural integrity, right? It's literally just about designating them as victims. And that's how we came to this absurd notion, right, that which is inversed, right, that Palestinians can be constructed as indigenous. And now I want to be clear here. For me, indigeneity doesn't have anything to do with whether people are allowed to live in a place. And it's actually not an inherent moral quality, right, to be indigenous. It does have normative aspects, but it just is a feature of a culture. It's just a way of saying that a people relates to a particular land as a kind of sacred land that is bound up with the reproduction of that culture and their civilizational continuity. And the reason I wouldn't get rid of the term indigeneity is because there are still many peoples in the world for whom it's a accurate descriptive characteristic to understand their relationship to territory and land and their own distinct civilizations that are distinct from the sort of colonizing nations or peoples that have come in and have subjugated them. And then it has a normative dimension at the level of we should be advocating for civilizational diversity and plurality. So that's where I think indigenous rights are important, because indigenous people should be able to preserve their cultures, and Jewish people should be able to preserve our culture, right? And our relationship and our connection to Israel, and that should not be criminalized. And so if indigeneity is a term that's descriptively accurate, and that it has enough of that normative force to say, well, we are being culturally erased. There's attempts at cultural genocide at us, which is basically what's happening now, is to kind of redefine us as not having a real culture, as just being these sort of so-called white settlers. Then I think it's valid for Jews to use the existing language and use it accurately and reappropriate these terms. But I agree that what makes anti-Zionism bad is not so much just that it's kind of inaccurate, right? It's not just a misrepresentation of Jews. It's a libel. Like the colonizer libel is a way of constructing Jews as foreign, as alien, as a kind of evil force, right? It's a way of racializing Jews as evil. And the left today can't really see this, right? Because they only see genocides and violence by colonizers to indigenous people. And so they've taken on this kind of bad version of indigeneity, this blood and soil nativism and fascism, really, that's just terrible. And they don't see how actually mass violence has often occurred to people constructed as colonizers. So in the Holocaust, Jews were constructed as this Central Asian horde, these nomadic barbarians who were invading Germany and wanted to take it over. So Wilhelm Marr, Edouard Drumont, classical anti-Semitism also constructed Jews sort of as colonizers, but of European states, and they were kind of murdered on that basis. And the Rwandan genocide is also similar. The Tutsis, using this Hamitic race theory, which was like an idea that there was a kind of quasi-European African race, the European colonialism originally introduced but was internalized by the Hutus, basically constructed Tutsis in a very similar way as Jews and Israelis are constructed today in Israel. That actually these people don't really belong. They are evil oppressors, evil invaders, and they're sort of proxy Europeans or quasi-Europeans themselves. So the left has been completely unable to see the violence involved in these so-called anti-colonial ideologies. And I think we really need to have a critical discourse that can recognize when constructing people as colonizers is just a form of racism. But the left...
I have one more question, and I'm going to turn it over to Phil. I'm a classical liberal in the sense I believe deeply in the free expression of ideas, which I think should be the basic operating system of a Western liberal democracy, right? And I want people to be able to argue, and I'm inherently critical of ideologies that try to stifle that. And what I worry about a little bit, but I really genuinely want you to tease this out for me, is that when we define something like anti-Zionism as a bigotry, that we may in the process sort of attempt to shut down discourse around it. So for example, I see it as a form of bigotry fundamentally. That doesn't mean every single person who falls into it, and I know, Phil, you want to pursue this line of questioning, is a radical bigot. They may just be sort of a quiet standbyer who absorbs the ideology without really understanding it too well. But if someone says, I disagree with you, Adam, or I disagree with you, David or Phil, that anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism or even a form of bigotry, should my impulse be, I'm sorry, but you are engaging in a form of bigotry yourself, and I'm going to not have that conversation with you because I think you're perpetuating this discourse that's trying to erase me as a Jew or erase my peoplehood. That's not my inclination because I'm trying to apply those same liberal principles to other realms of discourse. So in other words, when somebody wants to impose a very specific view of racism that I think goes too far, that wants to proclaim every structure in society as systemically racist, I want to be able to question that as well, because I think that's a dangerous tendency we have in our current discourse, and I want to be able to say, no, I'm sorry, I don't believe that's systemic racism. So there have to be rules of the game that allow me to say that, and I have to be able to apply those intellectually consistently. So, and I need to apply them to things that I hold dear as well, like anti-Zionism or Zionism. How would you respond to that?
I think this is a paradox of tolerance issue, right? Because if you value liberal values, if you value rational discourse where people can support their claims, when they can work with counter evidence, when they're demanded to engage in counter refutations of other people's claims, if you support that, you also need to be able to recognize when a discourse is not engaging in that. And that's been my personal experience with anti-Zionism. So at first, when I was encountering for the first time this flood of anti-Zionist hate, post October 7th, I tried arguing with anti-Zionists, right? And it was a harrowing experience. I tried reasoning with people in the academy, right? And just over and over again, I saw that they did not respond to counter evidence, right? They did not believe counter evidence was meaningful in any respect, right? Because there's a pre-existing assumption that their claims are true, right? So they exist in a dogmatic discourse where everything Israel does is evil because Israel is essentially evil, and Zionists who are marked as associated with evil, Israel are evil. And that even includes your objections to them, right? It's something that David Hirsch called the Livingstone formulation, right? If you object to it, if you say anti-Semitism, they say, well, you're just part of this conspiracy to legitimize the evil crimes of Israel.
That is absolutely the tendency, without a doubt, 100%. But there is a rare thoughtful critique. Let's just steel man that for a second. The one or two people who come up at this honestly, who approach you and aren't defining you out of the conversation because you're Zionist, but just still insist that they oppose Zionism for X, Y, or Z reasons. Maybe it's that they oppose all forms of nationalism, or maybe that they think ethno-nationalism of the Jewish variety is specifically morally problematic, and they are willing to make a good faith argument. Will you have that argument with that person? Why? And if so, why not?
Well, I don't buy it at this point. I think the anti-Zionism is too much of a holistic phenomenon and ideology. It's a holistic social movement. It has clear genealogical roots in totalitarian movements like the Nazi Islamist axis or Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda post-67, right? Or in these Western academic applications of settler colonial theory to Israel. Those are kind of the three genealogical sources I identify of anti-Zionism, which are all flawed. They aren't spontaneous critiques of Israeli policy. If someone is going to exist in that space, I would rather just dismiss it, right? And the whole issue of criticism of Israel, right? I say that, my job is to show people what anti-Zionism is rather than what it's not, right? If someone says, well, what's a legitimate criticism of Israel, right? Once you can see the phenomenon anti-Zionism, once you can see there's a real thing, it's like an apple, right? You see its borders. And then that debate disappears. Why does that debate exist today, right? The debate exists because there isn't a clear perception of anti-Zionism. So where is the line? People are debating it because they can't see the line, because they don't know what they're talking about, right? Because they're not even naming it. And there's a conceptual confusion at bottom that all that's going on is that there are people who are critical of Israel, and some of them are secretly anti-Semites. They're secret classical anti-Semites, right? We have to take off their mask and see, well, they only are criticizing Israel because they hate all Jews, or they don't like their neighbor Shlomo down the road. He's weird. He has a mezuzah. That means they don't like Israel. That's completely wrong, right? Like it's actually.
I agree that that's wrong. It doesn't really capture what we're dealing with. I'm going to turn over. Thank you for that, by the way. Phil, please take it from here.
Yeah. So, Adam, great to meet you. And this has been fascinating so far. And I want to push a little further even on where David was going. Talking about anti-Zionism as a hate movement, I want to focus a little bit on what the structure of a movement actually is, and to talk about how do we identify, what is the root of this movement, right? Who is actually leading the charge? What are the, or is it something that kind of lives on its own? And who are just the useful idiots that are being brainwashed into participating in the movement? And then how do you think about that? And how do you think about different treatments for people who are truly, know that what they're doing is lying and setting up a permission structure, if you will, for the movement, and the people who are, like in anti-Semitism, where they don't really know that they're anti-Semitic, but they participate in anti-Semitic behaviors. How do we kind of take that same structure to think about anti-Zionism?
Yeah, what I hear in your question is a little bit like the articulation of the Red-Green Alliance, right? You have the green kind of Islamist element. It's more explicitly violent. It doesn't have any concerns with separating anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism. They're all kind of fused within one kind of sort of anti-Jewish ideology. I mean, you can analytically distinguish the different tropes. If you read Osama bin Laden's letter to America, you can see, oh, well, this is the part about how the Torah is fake and Islam's the real religion and owns Eretz Yisrael. And, oh, this is the part they got from the protocols of how Jews control the world and control the banks and America. And then this is the part they got from anti-Zionism, how Jews are European colonists. right? But it's all kind of together for them. And then it's explicitly violent with explicit kind of aims. And then you have what people call the useful idiots, leftists who think that they are engaging in some noble human rights cause for Palestinians when they're actually really harming Palestinians by encouraging endless wars in which against a more powerful military in which civilians are suffering immensely. And so it's kind of why I like this term libel, actually, because a libel is different than a lie, right? Like a lie is something that one knows to be false and says it anyway, right? A libel is not always a lie. There are some people who are kind of libeling and lying at the same time, but there are other people who are really believers, right? So the power of a libel is that if you believe it, the violence that you then undertake feels justified. Right. So anti-Zionists always construct so-called Zionists as Nazis, right? There's an obvious element in that. One, it's inverting Jews' experience of the Holocaust. It's very cruel and brutal emotionally at that level. Two, Nazi is just a signifier of evil. So if you're constructing Jews as evil in our age, you call them Nazis. But three is also that if you really believe that Jews are Nazis, you would also think it's legitimate to take radical action against what they're doing. Right? So maybe you should have a mass movement against Israel if Israel's committing a Holocaust, right? So someone else could look at it as like, why is there a global movement of millions of people, right, to annihilate a tiny state of 9 million people, which happens to be the Jewish state, right? That seems completely absurd. It's clearly a pathological symptom of, and it's clearly involves bigotry and hatred and violence, right? But another person would say, well, it's true, right? It's true. Israel is a genocidal state. Israel is committing a genocide. We need as many people as possible to stop that so that we can save Palestinians. So it's libels, it's believing the libel, it's that dogmatic faith in the libel almost, and a desire for it to be true. Like you see this again and again with anti-Zionists. They so badly want Israel to have committed a genocide, right? They want the amount of Palestinian casualties to be higher. They want to find the highest number possible, right? And believe that. And so I think that's kind of the key, and that's how you get the whole problem of, are these people joining the protests well-meaning or not? I think it's almost kind of irrelevant, right? Are they well-meaning in that they want to help Palestinians? Well, there are also people who are quite willing to believe that a particular group of people are extremely evil just because someone told them that once, right? So it's really just the force of libel to encourage belief and to whip a mob up into a frenzy that I think is kind of the engine of the anti-Zionist movement.
Right. So the original Christ killers libel has, evolved into new ones around genocide, apartheid, and so forth. So a practical question, which I worry about, as we have seen over the last several years, we fight not just with non-Jews, but amongst ourselves about definitions of anti-Semitism. Now we're going to have a new, it's not a new term, but a new term that we focus on, anti-Zionism, to try to describe the hate. So we're going to have arguments about what that is amongst ourselves and with the outside world. And you're already starting to see this, then we want to have arguments about whether the two things actually mean the same thing, mean something different. So now we're having three separate arguments about, essentially what you've characterized in saying it's hate against Jews. That's what matters. How do we not get ourselves into this trap where we're arguing about the definition of two words, that whether they're the same word, a different word? How do we break out of that and actually make change?
Yeah, as Jews, we like to have these kind of neurotic, nitpicky arguments. It's not inherently a bad thing. Maybe it makes us not great always at organizing into a grassroots activist movement where you kind of just need to have some slogans and you need to be ready to just put things out there and let them, have their force in the public space and not always kind of be so concerned that every tiny thing you can read it in this or that way. But I don't see it is a problem if we develop a discourse around anti-Zionism. So I loved that David said that there was now something called the new anti-Zionism discourse, because that's what I want to see, right? I want to see people talking about anti-Zionism, right? And I want the legacy organizations to fight anti-Zionism. I want them to have a effective messaging, to effective education as well. But if there are people also who want to disagree about anti-Zionism, what's important is the fact that we recognize that anti-Zionism is a phenomenon, that it's something, it's dangerous, it's bad, right? If we want to disagree on the nuances of what it is or how it came to be, the exact story of how we got there, I welcome that.
Right. A couple more questions. So there's always the elephant in the room that we've had through our history, and in this case, one of the elephants in the room is the anti-Zionist Jew. How do we, and we're all asked to explain that person anytime we're in an argument? Well, how do you explain? And I won't give specific names. We all know who they are, both in the academy and outside the academy, and in the world of journalism and so forth. How do you think about taking that head on as we kind of wend our way through educating everybody else about anti-Zionism, why it's wrong, why it's bad, when they can always kind of refer to the guy in the corner of the room that's the anti-Zionist Jew?
I think it's another problem with the current anti-Semitism frame, right? So colloquially, anti-Semitism sort of means a bigotry against Jews as Jews, and the focus is often on diaspora Jews and Jews in that sense, right? And when you assume that, then when you show someone that there are Jews who oppose so-called Zionism, it becomes kind of impossible to make the claim that so-called anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, because the way anti-Semitism is defined, that doesn't work. And so trying to fight for that statement, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, doesn't really work. And then you get into these questions of, is Zionism Judaism? And to show that anti-Zionism is hate, you have to reduce Zionism to Judaism, which, to be honest, they have a lot of good arguments against, right? It's not exactly accurate if you look historically that Judaism and Zionism were the same. It's completely true that there was Satmar Hasidism, that it was even perhaps normative within rabbinic Judaism not to return to the land of Israel, right? And that's also why I think sort of defending Zionism is also not what this is about. So we need to explain that anti-Zionism at its core is a kind of anti-Israeli racism. It's a hatred of Israelis, right? And then it's a hatred of those who are marked as Zionists. So people who are not marked as Zionists, Jews who pass a litmus test, or they stay quiet and silent, or they come out explicitly as anti-Zionist and receive tons of rewards and stuff from the broader society, they play a crucial role in legitimizing anti-Zionism. But once we recognize anti-Zionism as its own thing, right, that argument will no longer work. They'll say, well, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism because there are Jews. Well, we go, well, anti-Zionism is discrimination against those marked as Zionists, right? And it becomes unnecessary to conceptually or rhetorically anchor it in anti-Semitism. Now, that doesn't mean we're not acknowledging that it's part of the broader history of Jew hate, and from a genealogical perspective, there are classical anti-Semitic elements that contributed to the creation of anti-Zionism, just as there are kind of theological anti-Judaic elements that contributed to the creation of anti-Zionism. But we're not resting our case on showing that it's using these older tropes, or that it's somehow secretly against so-called all Jews. It targets Jews as a kind of collective. It targets Jewish peoplehood. And at that level, it's very happy to exempt anti-Zionist Jews.
Yeah. One of the things you said in there, I was going to say, one of the things you said in there that I think is really important that I want to make sure that everybody heard is it's not just that anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitism. It's that it isn't the counter to Zionism. It's its own thing. It's not just the opposite of Zionism, which is what anti-Zionists have successfully argued and has put us a little bit in a box, right? I'm against the concept of Zionism. Your argument is that is not what you are. You are using that as a way to create out of whole cloth a new movement, a new hate movement against Jews. And you are convincing others that they are just anti-Zionist, but that is a clever rhetorical tool in order to get them to follow your path. Is that a fair?
100%. So I have a great example of this actually that just happened today, but it's something that's very frequent. So there's something that now I'm just calling it the Jabotinsky libel because it's actually a trope of anti-Zionism that they will refer to Jabotinsky's Iron Wall essay where he did use a comparison between Zionism and European colonialism, and he compared the Palestinians to basically Native Americans. And so they always kind of it's actually like medieval anti-Judaism. They would comb through the Talmud and find these quotes and selectively extract them to prove that Jews were evil. Anti-Zionists basically do this with the historical record of Zionism. They comb through Herzl's quotes to find an evil one, and they get Jabotinsky and say, well, Jabotinsky compared Jews as Zionists to white settlers, right? So I thought this was very interesting because it did not matter what I thought about Jabotinsky. So I just said, I didn't debate it. I said, this is Jabotinsky libel. It's a trope, right? And someone said, oh, it's a libel even when it's in your own words. And I found that response so striking because he said, your words. And I was like, well, I'm not Jabotinsky. Right? Like, do I have to agree with Jabotinsky? So it wasn't about my beliefs. He didn't know if I agreed with everything Jabotinsky said. It was that I was being marked as a Zionist, right? And a Zionist was their own construct, where Jabotinsky, however they imagine him, is a stereotypical Zionist. It's a stereotype. Netanyahu is a stereotypical Zionist. Ben Gvir is a stereotypical Zionist. There's his character, and they projected that on
you
me.
must be him. You are him. You must be him.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. So yes, anti-Zionism is what constructs Zionism and the Zionist in this way. It's not concerned with people's actual political beliefs, and so it's not a critique of an ideology. It's a racial stereotype.
Yeah. So you have earned some critics in these very few months of this new anti-Zionism, and I've been intrigued as a sort of a lurker on some of the various Facebook posts and the like. And I'm curious, like, and maybe there's a little bit of jealousy of your like sort of sudden notoriety in this this niche neck of the woods that you've developed. But tell me, like, what are some of those criticisms, and what do you make of them?
I think the core criticism is that one feels that I emphasize the discontinuity of anti-Zionism too much, and that
That's David Hirsch, for example, right? Would argue that.
Yeah, both Hirsch and Tabarovsky, who I have immense admiration for, who are basically my intellectual heroes, they both kind of feel that conceptually and linguistically. So I disassociate them, but there was confusion in the debate, right? Because it wasn't clear to me whether they were objecting merely to not using the word anti-Semitism, and then saying, well, it's just the word we use, or they were objecting at something more conceptual, right? But from my point of view, I see the two as linked. So I try to distance myself from the word anti-Semitism, the way the word anti-Semitism is used as a speech act, basically just always saying it's anti-Semitic. And because I also see that always creates this conceptual mapping of anti-Zionism back onto anti-Semitism, classical anti-Semitism, as if it's the same. Now, they were saying we recognize anti-Zionism's its own anti-Jewish ideology, but we want to call it anti-Semitic. But at other times, they were saying we call it anti-Semitic because it is like classical anti-Semitism. It's the same conspiracy theories. And I had an interesting debate with a colleague of mine who's also a fellow at the London Center, who Matthias Alexandri, who he was kind of more explicitly making the conceptual argument. He was saying we actually shouldn't see anti-Zionism as structurally different from conspiratorial classical anti-Semitism. And that seems to be actually, my understanding is that is what David and Isabella think. And I understand Isabella's point of view from the material she's working with, which I tried to make clear that
right from the Soviet experience. Of it was just a way. It was just a way of repackaging anti-Semitism in
with
the
new libels.
late 1960s, right?
Soviet anti-Zionism is highly classically anti-Semitically inflected. A lot of the people like Ivanov and Primakov and Begin and all these people seems to have read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I mean, Ivanov's Caution Zionism from 1969, it's basically kind of like someone decided to continue the story of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion with sort of later meetings of the World Zionist Organization that he goes through, right? So, and it's not that different in many ways from like Rosenberg's Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazis' book on Zionism from like the 20s, right, where he was also applying conspiratorial protocol style anti-Semitism to Zionism. So I think that Soviet anti-Zionism is quite marked by classical anti-Semitism, but it also is part of the story of how anti-Zionism emerged. Right? So if they needed to sort of rebrand or reframe anti-Semitism, it's not the case that that wasn't something creative as well. They did come up with new labels. Zionism is racism, Zionism is Nazism, it's fascism, bourgeois nationalism, revision. They have all of their own tropes that they did create. But the conspiratorial element, like the octopus-like conspiracies, is more marked there. Whereas I think that in Arab nationalist anti-Zionism, people like Fayez Sayegh in 1965, or the Journal of Palestine Studies kind of research, they also have some of that protocol style stuff.
It's religious. It's also a religious anti-Semitism as well.
I think it's the theological anti-Judaism, both from Arab Christians and Muslims, is more marked, and it's more about Zionism itself as kind of just this essentially evil presence of the Jewish nation as racist and exclusivist in the land, and it's seen as imperialist, but there's less about these kind of infiltrating Zionists. So I think there are different streams and different elements, and so I understand why with Isabella's focus on Soviet anti-Zionism, the classical anti-Semitism element is more present, and it feels a little bit jarring to separate anti-Zionism from the term anti-Semitism.
I have one more question, Phil. I don't know if you do. Maybe we can hit. If you do, we can hit them both. My last question is: what makes you think we can be successful in imposing this new anti-Zionism, or in advancing it? Let me say, not impose, advancing it, when we're, as you know, sort of the weaker party in all this. I mean, the anti-Zionists pretend to be the weaker party when in fact they enjoy tremendous hegemony. Why would we, and we've been, the idea of reclaiming Zionism has been around a long time. I mean, I wrote an article about that, I think in 2011, like it's time to reclaim the term Zionism, even if it's not popular, we've got to do it anyway because there's no other term that satisfies our own national aspirations. That's been around a long time. And yet if anything, we've lost power in that endeavor in those years. I think there's some proud Jews, and I want to make, for that reason alone, it's worth doing. But it seems to me a tall order to try to do what you're doing.
But before you answer, Adam, because I was going to ask something very similar, talk a little bit about Maz and what you're trying, what you're practically trying to do as you talk about or answer David's question.
Yeah, so we find that change happens very quickly when we switch the gaze, really, from the anti-Zionist gaze on the Jew, on Israel all the time, accusing Israel, spreading libels, and then Jews just responding by defending and talking about Israel, when we switch it to talking about anti-Zionism. And we think that's the key. It's from inward attention, which a lot of the Jewish community has right now, to outward attention. So we need to speak outwardly to the wider world and speak about anti-Zionism and tell them that anti-Zionism is bad. Right. And we are not even doing that right now. It's actually kind of stunning, right? Like, Jews are not telling the world that anti-Zionism is bad. We're seeing violence. We say it's anti-Semitic. We don't explain the libels that go into that violence. We don't explain the ideology. We continue to legitimize it as a political discourse, and then just explain ourselves, explain Zionism, explain Israel, give people history lessons that, of course, like we were talking about earlier, these anti-Zionists aren't rational. They don't really care about the real history of Israel. They just mine it as a kind of text, like as a kind of Talmud, to selectively appropriate these hostile fragments, right? So change happens quickly when anti-Zionists are told that they are doing something wrong, and that is what we need to do. We think that if we just say it's anti-Semitic, this word anti-Semitism will have so much power. We have these institutional levers. We have Holocaust memory. It'll all just kind of jam into place and shut this down. We've seen that that's not working because anti-Zionists feel that they are doing something different, and they have some intuitive legitimacy in feeling that it's different, as long as people aren't saying, okay, it's different, but it's also bad, right? And so we need to shift.
In fact, it might be making it worse because we accuse them of being anti-Semitic and they are 100% certain they are not anti-Semitic.
Yeah, because they see that they don't use classical anti-Semitic canards, right? Like someone like Hassan Piker, I mean, occasionally he says some kind of conspiratorial stuff, but still it's focused on Israel. It's focused on his claims and his libels about Israel. So he thinks he's a conscientious objector to Israel. Right. And we want to say, yeah, of course, we can engage in political criticism and critique about Israel, instead of saying, well, yes, of course, but there's something called anti-Zionism that just is real. It's just a hate movement against Israel that spreads libels, etc. And we can talk about it and oppose it.
Right. Well, Adam, this has been extremely illuminating. And while I may not agree on every minutia, and I'm still working this out, my hat's off to you for really building a lot of this new intellectual movement, and I'm very impressed. I think you're a great writer, by the way, and I enjoy reading you. I just reread your tablet article this morning. Thought, wow, this is, I read it at the time, but it really just beautifully stated, and I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. And I'm kind of interested in, Phil and I are gonna interview a bunch of people, including some people who are probably a bit critical of your approach. After we do that, I might want to circle back to you and say, okay, here's what we've learned. What do you think? And because I just think you offer so much to this, and thank you for joining the fray.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm glad you guys are doing this series. It's amazing, really exciting.
All right. And when we're done with it, or even as they come out, please feel free to share them. We'd really like to get the conversation going.
Definitely.
So, Phil, that was a fascinating conversation with Adam Louis-Klein. And I have to say, I was quite impressed by him. I may disagree with certain aspects of it. I'm still working my way through it all. I'm a little worried about his unwillingness to debate or have debates with anti-Zionists, because I have to stay true to my own classical liberal principles, because I want to keep a maximally open Overton window, right? I want to make sure that society allows us to talk about all sorts of things, and I can't just shut down conversation around things that affect me. Though I have to say, it's to me he's probably right that anti-Zionism is its own form of bigotry and very rarely allows open conversation. And I may be a little bit critical about his willingness to use the discourse, post-colonial discourse, in a way that tries to invert it, or to apply it in a way that's not bigoted toward Jews, because I worry it keeps that discourse going. But he's sophisticated, and he had very good answers to both of my concerns. What did you think overall?
Yeah, I thought it was a great discussion. I think that what obviously kind of introducing this into the system, was an important contribution that he made. The most important point that he made, which I think we do both agree with, is that anti-Zionism is not, the opposite of Zionism. Just like anti-anti-Zionism, which we're coining, I guess, isn't equal to Zionism, right? It's not
right.
Just a defense of Zionism. It is a critique and a study of anti-Zionism with a kind of a critical lens to it. And I think that those things in and of themselves are the most important points that he made. Whether we're kind of a little bit still going to be dancing on the head of a few pins here, deciding how much of it is classical anti-Semitism, how much of it is different, and so forth. And that's okay. We'll have lots of good conversations about that. But it's, in the end, it goes back to the end of what you said. How do we use what we've learned to counteract the libels?
Yeah. I think also making a delineation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is an important innovation in the discourse. And the reason I believe it is that too often our community does become trapped in the language of classical anti-Semitism and then doesn't have the wherewithal to really deal with anti-Zionism in its distinct form. So I think he's right to push that into our conversation and let us wrestle with it. I think he's a little too optimistic about his ability to sort of to win. He doesn't have a lot of evidence to make that case that if you just turn it around, you can change it. We'll see. I mean, more power to him. I'd like, I'm going to be watching carefully, and if I see us gaining ground because his methods and his arguments work, then I'm going to use it too. But just experience tells me that those kind of highly optimistic projections are just that, and that this is an uphill battle. Doesn't mean we can't win it over time or make progress, but I feel like he might be a little too optimistic about his own arguments.
Well, we'll have lots of conversations with lots of people, and maybe then can formulate how we win this battle.
Everything I say now is just hypothesis, okay?
Exactly.
And maybe and let's take it through the gauntlet and see where we end up after 6-8 of these conversations. But I think we're off to a great start.
I agree. Terrific.
All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and stay tuned for more.